the third folio edition of the plays of William Shakespeare. I'm Adam Douglas, Senior Book Specialist at Peter Harrington, and I'd like to show you this copy of the third folio, which in some ways is the rarest of the 4 17th century folios. If I get out a cushion just to look after the book, we can take a look at this famous volume. Now, the third folio was issued in 2 impressions, and the first impression of it was really a straight reprint of the second folio. But in this second issue, it has added to it for the first time these 7 plays, which is the title page says, is added 7 plays never before printed in folio. There's Pericles, Prince of Tyre, The London Prodigal, The History of Thomas Cromwell, Sir John Oldcastle, The Puritan Widow, A Yorkshire Tragedy, and Locrine. Now, of those, only Pericles is now accepted as being authentically Shakespearean, but that Pericles, this is the first appearance in print of Pericles in the folios, and we see at the bottom here the second of the 2 title pages. It's London printed for PC 1664. Now, in the first impression, there was a rather curious thing where the portrait had been space left for the portrait on the title page, but in this impression, the portrait, the famous portrait of Shakespeare, is facing the title page, as was continued in the 4th folio, and is how we usually expect to see it, with Ben Jonson's verses to the reader below the figure of Shakespeare. So the reason for its rarity is often been debated, but the likeliest explanation is that the printing date of this edition, 1664, is perilously close to the Great Fire of London. And the Great Fire of London famously burnt down St Paul's, where most of the booksellers had their premises outside in the precincts of the cathedral, and when that was burnt down, the stock of this book was lost, which explains its rarity. In other respects, it's like the other folios. It prints the plays, all the comedies, histories and tragedies, in double column within this frame around the text. And this is a nice copy of the book with a few of the little marks that you'd expect to see in a folio that's been consulted over the years. You sometimes get little brown marks, spill burns they call them, where perhaps a little bit of candle has fallen onto the page, or you sometimes get rust stains or other little marks. And there are a few of those, but not too many, to detract from a very nice copy of the book. With early folios, one likes to go to the end and see if there's been any messing around, any sort of restoration. This here, as we'd expect to see a little in this binding, we've got a little paper restoration just at the tips of the last couple of leaves there, but in pretty good order. And back to the front, if I can put it that way, we see that the portrait of Shakespeare, the frontispiece portrait, has been trimmed around the image and is laid down. That first leaf of the folio would be very liable to damage when the first binding started to fall apart, as perhaps it might do with repeated reading. So this is not the first binding of the book. If I can just show you the binding, it's a grand 19th century binding, very typical of the way 19th century binders would treat Shakespeare, with a fully gilt spine and all the decoration in the spine panels there, and some nice dog tooth roll there, and gilt fillets around the edge just to show a bit of style. It's a little bit of wear on the binding, but nothing too bad. And we find that the binder has signed it here up at the top left-hand corner of the end paper. And he signed it there, bound by Francis Bedford, who was one of the smartest binders in London at the time. And we see here also a little shelf mark next to it in pencil, W11A, copy 3, which is rather grand. Whoever had this had 3 copies of the third folio. And when we look at the front paste down, we see that it was the American millionaire Pierpont Morgan, whose library is now in New York City, a famous library, and it was a famous collection. And in fact, we've seen the invoice when on the day that he bought this book. He bought it in London from the London booksellers Henry Sutherland's, and on the same day he bought all 4 Shakespeare folios and a Gutenberg Bible for cash. Those days are gone, sadly, but this is a magnificent copy of the rare third folio. For more details on this and other works, please see the Peter Harrington website.